All right, well, good morning. My name is Steve Rahi. I am a Premier Field Engineer specializing in system-centered technologies. We're going to spend today talking about collections and how they work inside Configuration Manager 2012, some of the specific ways in which collections are fairly pivotal to making sure Configuration Manager 2012 works. So I want to go through them, the different options they offer, and so on. So here is a bit of our agenda. So I want to go first of all through types of collections, right? There's user defined, system defined. I'll talk about those and some of the roles that a collection that collections actually play. Really one role, but we'll see the scope, if you will, of why collections are important. Go through the process of building some collections, talk about options for building collections, uh, talk about the role that collections actually can play in security, and then I want to touch a bit on processing, how collection updating actually is handled, how the processing works, and so on. So we'll spend most of the time in demo, but we'll start off here. Right. So in Configuration Manager 2012, there are two types of collections. There are the traditional, very familiar user-based collections, and I'm sorry, the device-based collections, system-based collections. Then there are user-based collections. We've had device and user-based collections as long as I can remember in the product. The key difference now is in Config Manager 2012, user collections really do actually have more focus. There's something that you're going to actually use a lot more. So let me explain that for a minute. So most things that you might have done historically in Configuration Manager would be actions targeted to devices. So whenever you do deployments or uh, different tasks, you're thinking of targeting those tasks to systems in your environment. Well, one of the design pillars of Configuration Manager 2012 is to really factor the user very heavily into the scoping of how you deliver content in your environment, right? So that whole discussion gets into talks about deployment and strategies there, right? Important topics, that we'll discuss, but really at this juncture, it's just talking about the collections needed to facilitate that interaction between deployments and the user. Those are user-based collections. And so like no time before, you're going to factor user-based collections into your overall scope if you want to make sure that the user's experience really is the best that it can be, right? So again, that to really pull the covers back on that is more of a deployment kind of discussion, but at least to highlight the difference. So it used to be the user collections were pretty much ignored. Now they're going to take much more center stage. So two types, you'll see them in a minute, and we'll go through them. Now in terms of the roles of a collection, I kind of put this together, a little scattergram of the different components of Config Manager that tie into and use collections. As I'm looking at this, I realize I forgot one of them, right? But let's just talk through these. The one that I forgot, which I'll mention here so I don't forget it again, is client settings, right? All of these items, including client settings, are those things that you would ultimately want to deploy in some form or fashion to your environment. So client settings, customize client settings. So say you have in your environment by default, maybe you want to run hardware inventory every weekly for all of your devices. But there's a certain grouping of devices that you need hardware inventory to run daily. You couldn't really accomplish that within a single site in previous versions of Configuration Manager. With custom client settings and the ability to set those things up for device settings, even user settings, you can deploy client settings to an environment very specifically, and you use collections for that. Again, I'll show you all of these. I'll kind of walk through these in a minute, show you the areas or whatever uh, in the console. But other things, configuration baselines are there. Deployments, applications, packages, task sequences, software updates, power management settings, variables, uh, on and on we go, right? Maintenance windows and so on, firewall policy, malware policy, all of these things are only workable if we have some sort of target environment in which to use them, right? That the way that we target these items are all based on collections. So ultimately, all of these items you have to deploy, right? The target of every deployment is a collection. So we have to tie these items to a collection so that we know what to do. Our config manager clients, our config manager users actually know what the heck to do, right, in the environment. So that's why I kind of put the scattergram up there again. These all could be separate topics, and some of them, will be as we go along, perhaps. But they all tie to collections, and that's why the collection itself and having good skill and understanding about how to build this thing, very, very important, right? And some of these items actually live on the collection, which I'll show you those in a minute. All right, so a little bit of discussion here. We'll go into the console and spend a lot of time there. So in terms of collections, we have to think about building collections. Well, there's a number of ways that we can build collections. There's a number of topics that come into play whenever we think about building collections, right? There's four major categories of things that I have here. The first one is criteria. So as you'll see in a minute, there are really four criteria types that you can use when you build a collection. The first is what's called a direct membership rule. Then there's query, limit, an exclusion, an explicit exclusion, an explicit include. I'll explain all those to you in a minute when we get to the console. But then we have this fifth one down here, which does merit a bit of discussion. Again, I'll show it to you in the console, and this is the idea of a limiting collection. So that has some pretty direct ties to security in Configuration Manager 2012. Some of the paradigm shift that we have in terms of security is really brought to bear by limiting collections, right? So let me pause right here, and I'm going to go ahead and move the lab into scope, and we're going to talk about how we build some of these things, right? All right, so let's go into our assets and collection node. We see user collections, we see device collections, right? I'm going to focus on the device collections because these actually have more options, and this is still what you use probably most of the time, though the user collections are just as important for various scenarios. So I'm going to go through and create, I'm going to go through and create a collection here. I was going to show you one that I already had, but I'll go through and create it. And this will allow me to actually talk about all of those five options that I just mentioned. I'm just going to call this thing test. So kind of going in reverse order. The first thing that I have here is the idea of what's called a limiting collection. All right? Now, you've always had this box, the ability to specify limiting collection. In 2007, it was there. Difference is, in 2007, it was not required, right? In 2012, we absolutely require this box be filled out, right? Why is that? Well, the answer is, let's compare and contrast 2012 and 2007. So what would happen if you did not have a limiting collection? If you did not have a limiting collection in 2007, what that simply meant is all of the systems in the environment were potential candidates for inclusion in your collection. So a good example, say that you're building a collection here. Let me give this a little bit more realistic name. Let's say Windows 7 with Adobe. Okay, so or let's say Windows 7 x64, whatever, just something simple, right? So if you, in 2007, if you were not going to limit your collection membership, then the query that constructs this collection, which you'll see that in a minute, would have the total job of making sure that out of every system in your environment, only those that you needed in this collection, those Windows 7 x64, would be factored in. But the potential target list that could be included in the collection would be every device in your environment, right? Which consequently, if you have a whole bunch of devices in your environment, it just can potentially make the query run a little bit longer too, right? Well, in 2012, we force you to limit your scope. Now, you can still have a wide open scope, right? There's collections that will allow you to do that, namely all systems. But what this facilitates is if you have a particular collection, say that you have a Windows 7, all Windows 7 systems, right? That all Windows 7 might include an x64 and x86. If you want to just carve out the x64 systems from your environment, then it really doesn't make any sense to target every potential system. It would be more efficient to scope in on just your Windows 7 population and limit your collection to just your Windows 7 population, and then you have a smaller list of systems that you can build from. Okay? That's what this allows you to do with collection limiting. Now, let me give you another example, which is security related. I'll talk more about security in a bit. So one of the challenges, if you will, one of the limitations, if you will, of ConfigMgr in previous versions was the fact that you really couldn't take a scene. You could, but it had some difficulties, right? One of the reasons you would see multiple configuration manager environments inside organizations was because you might have a server team that was separate from the desktop team in terms of managing needs, and they really didn't want the servers to show up in the same environment as the desktops because they didn't want to have a possibility of managing systems that they weren't responsible for, right? So for that reason, you would see a couple of different config manager sites or hierarchies or whatever show up in an environment. Strictly, it wasn't really needed in 2007, but it was kind of a waste of resources. You could oftentimes do more management within an environment than the number of systems that you actually put on there, right? So in 2012, one of the things we did was modify the security model a bit so that you could actually safely combine, in this example, workstations and servers, and there's other examples too, in a single environment, and allow the workstation admins to only see their workstations, allow the server admins to only see their servers, and you don't have any possibility of crossing responsibility, even though servers and workstations are in the same environment. Right? One of the ways that we facilitate, in fact, the total way that we facilitate that, is through this thing called collection limiting. Right? So again, I'm going to show you the mechanics of it in a minute, but just while we're here, think of it this way. So let me back out of here, or pull this down for a minute. So you'll see back here there's this collection called all systems. Well, if you look in all systems, it is going to contain every system in the config manager environment. In the workstation server example, it will contain workstations and servers. So obviously that collection is not a good one for use in presenting to the workstation administrators because it also contains servers. It's not a good one to present to the server administrators because it also contains workstation. But it would be a good collection kind of to base others on, because it does contain your total environment. So the kind of structure that we would set up here, think of it this way: we could build an all organizational servers environment collection. Okay, and so we could say we want to build a collection, and there's actually one up there, I think one, yeah. I don't remember if I kept one or not. Anyway, I'll put it again. So we can say we want to build all servers, and the only thing we want in this collection is all of our servers. Well, we can still base it on all systems and use that as our target population to pull the servers out of. The point is, and you can use any collection you want to, frankly, I mean, any collection can be a limiting collection. The point of this discussion is now you take your all systems as the base because all systems has everything, and you build your own custom all servers collection. You build your own custom all workstations collection for your needs, right? And then you use those to scope specific users' views into the environment. So think, once we build this collection, once we build and scope it to all systems, then this collection, once we add the criteria, which we haven't done yet, will only contain servers. Well, you can then use this collection as the starting point for server admins. Okay? So what normally would happen in 2007 is people would see all systems, they would see everything. But if you want to, you can build your own base collection structure for your server admins, your own base collection structure for your workstation admins, with those base collection structures built in this way by limiting, you're by default limiting the scope of what they can see from the very beginning. So building of the collection is one step. There's actually another step of how you pull that in and associate with the user, which I'll show you in a minute. But that's the point of this, all right? And again, this is just an example of what you could do. There's a bunch of possibilities of what you could do, but another way to think of it is that you're creating your own buckets, your organizational buckets inside your organization, so that you can carve up the environment and let people view it just as you want without having to go to the expense, the administrative effort of having a whole bunch of different site servers, right, for that purpose, or hierarchies or whatever. Hope that makes sense. We'll revisit that as we go along in a little bit and see that more, right? So that's the limiting part. So let's talk about criteria now. So the whole point of building a collection is to have members of the collection. Whether those members are devices or users, these are device collections. They're, the other collections are user collections. One thing to point out here, in ConfigMgr 2007, you could actually have devices and users in the same collection. In ConfigMgr 2012, you cannot. A collection will either uniquely contain devices or it will uniquely contain users. It will not contain both, right? So in terms of how you decide, how you can configure what devices are in a collection in this case, you have 4 types of rules that you can use. The most common are the direct rule and the query-based rule. So the direct rule basically allows you to statically define the members of a collection. So this is useful in many scenarios, but the thing to remember is it is not dynamic. You are directly specifying the membership manually or through script or something like that, right? Whereas the beauty of a query-based collection is you specify the criteria and we just maintain that collection for you on an automatic schedule, right? And so as systems enter into the environment, they are evaluated based on the rules you set up in the query, and they either enter the collection or are removed from the collection based on those query results, right? So query-based is the most robust. Oftentimes it's preferred. It is not a requirement. You can definitely use direct memberships very effectively, but be aware of the difference. Another thing that I've seen at a number of customer environments is that they will go ahead and get frustrated using query-based because it's not returning the results they expect, and they will go with the direct membership because they can specify membership rules and see exactly what they want. That works, right? So you can do it. But the one thing about it, query-based works beautifully as well. If you're not getting the results that you expect, it's probably because you haven't crafted the query effectively, or you're maybe crossing some boundaries. So a good example where I see this a lot. If you're building queries, well, I'll save that. I'll save that discussion when we get into the details of the query-based. Okay. So let's take a look at what you can do in a direct rule. Right. So a direct rule is going to pop up another wizard, and it's going to ask you, what kind of resource class do you want to factor into this query? So there's really only 2 types, either a system resource. This is a device-based collection, so it's a system-based collection. So we will have certain resource information available for systems that we can tag off of. The list of options in direct membership is far less than what we would have in a query-based membership. You'll see that shortly. Then we have unknown computers. So unknown computers are a specific type that's really there to support OSD, but you can build collections based on that too. I've rarely seen a situation where you need to. Most of it's system resource. Well, when you hit system resource, there's a number of different attributes that you can tag to uniquely specify the membership of your collection. Most always, it's going to be something like netBIOS name, right? So netBIOS name, that would be an attribute. You could do MAC address. You could do all those things, right? If you wanted to, again, use one of those to carve out the membership, you could. Remember, though, this is static. So whatever attribute you're going to choose, you're ultimately going to need to pick from a list. So maybe you know the name, maybe you know a part of the name, maybe you don't know the name at all. So whatever the case may be, we do support direct names if you want to put it in here, and we'll filter the list. We support wildcards, so partial names, total wildcards if you don't know any part of the name, right? Also, notice these options, which are really nice. These are new in 2012. Exclude members or resources marked as obsolete. As devices are in the environment, sometimes they will go into a state known as obsolete. You can include those in the collection. It's really no harm, no foul if you do. Obsolete devices aren't factored into deployments and so on, but they do make the collection a little bit messy to the eye sometimes, so you can choose to avoid those. Or exclude resources that do not have the ConfigMgr client installed, right? So whenever you specify a name or a string to match against or whatever, we're going to go find all of the resources that match that name, whether they are actually ConfigMgr clients or not. Remember, to be discovered and available in the ConfigMgr environment doesn't necessarily mean that the ConfigMgr client is installed. Hopefully it does, but you can, for example, run an AD discovery and find a whole bunch of machines that never have the client, and they will be in your database and just as much a possibility to match here as any other machine. So if you want to make sure you just include your ConfigMgr clients, you can put this check mark on. So I've just put a wildcard here, which means I want to be able to select from all of the systems in my environment, and this is the total list in my small lab. So I can just put check marks here, select all of them, whatever I want, and then it will go in and be added to my collection, and I'm done. Right? So again, that's a direct membership rule. You can do that manually, but as you can tell, if you're maintaining this list manually, it can be a bit cumbersome. Right? Here's the other thing, right? If you're maintaining this list, if you're doing this manually and you reinstall a client, okay, it may not reflect back in this collection, because the membership of this collection are those machines that are active and that you choose at the time at which the collection is updated, right? When you define the collection. So if you remove and reinstall the client for this machine later, it's not current any longer. It's actually, depending on how you do it, it could be considered, probably will be, a new client. So it's not going to automatically show back up in this collection. You'd have to go back and manage it again. So again, while direct memberships can be useful, and I'll give you an example of where that is useful in a minute, they are a little bit more maintenance, perhaps, sometimes a lot more. Right? So then why would you want to use these? Well, I'll give you a great example of where you'd want to use it. So one of the features in ConfigMgr 2012 is operating system deployment. So the example I'll give you is on operating system deployment, but it could apply across many different examples. So one of the customers that I work with routinely deploys operating systems to their environment, but they don't want to give the console to end users. They want to make it a web page that the user can go pick and choose what operating systems they want to deploy, pick and choose the options that they want to deploy, and so on, and pick the machines that they want to deploy to that operating system too. So it could be 1 to 10 machines at a time or whatever. So there's a lot of possibilities and discussion options that come off of that scenario, and I'll describe a number of them as we go along. But specifically here, in terms of the number of machines they want to target, when they pick and choose the machines they're targeting in the web page, in essence what they're doing is creating a static list that they want that deployment of the operating system to go to. So what we can programmatically do on the back end is create a collection and populate it with those same machines and then deploy the operating system to that collection. The user never sees any of that. All they see is the web page listing out the machines they want to deploy to, and they click OK. On the back end, we're creating a collection, we're adding direct members, and we're tying the deployment of the operating system to the collection so that just those machines get it, right? It's a great example of using direct membership rules based on that kind of interaction. And there's others, right? But we'll use that same operating system deployment example as we go through a couple of these other things, right? So bear that in mind, and I'll return to it hopefully if I remember. So that's direct. Another kind of membership rule that's available is called the query-based rule. This one's a little bit more complex, but it's not hard to set up at all, right? And I'm leaving the direct membership rule here just to illustrate this point. You can absolutely have multiple rule types on a collection. You can have a query-based rule right next to a direct membership rule, right next to an include rule, right? So you'll see that. So a query-based rule is, as I said, this rule that you build to directly specify a dynamic selection criteria for those systems you want to include in a collection, okay, or users, okay, in a user collection case. So whenever you're setting up a query-based collection, it's a graphical build-out process for the query, or you, if you want to, could write the query yourself. Okay, so let me show this to you. So I'll call this test query. Okay, so if I have a query already built, like in a queries node of the ConfigMgr console, which you don't see here, but if you go under monitoring, you'll see a queries node. It's going to look very similar to the things you're going to see here, right? Queries are, in essence, collections that really don't serve as a target for anything, right? Queries are just going to return results to you. So if you spent the time, and they're great for reporting and quick checks and different things, right? Most people don't use queries anymore, though some live and die by them. If you do have a query built, then you can go and import a query statement from the list of queries. So these are just predefined queries that are in ConfigMgr over in the monitoring node. So if you build out custom queries, you can see them here. So if you've already spent the time to build out a custom query, then you can include it here. Here's one thing to understand about it. So I mentioned that query-based collections are dynamically updating, and that's absolutely true, right? What sometimes people expect, if they import a query statement from your queries list, and then later they go to the queries node specifically and change the underlying structure of that query, they expect that the collection based on that query will update as well. And that doesn't happen, right? So the import of the query is a one-time convenience for you. So if you do spend time building out queries, you can definitely do a one-time import to save yourself the effort of building this stuff again. But if you ever change the query that you imported, it doesn't carry forward into the collection. You would have to go back and change the collection as well, right? So just bear that in mind. But you don't have to import the query. You can go and build your own query statement just fine, clicking the Edit Query Statement rule, or button here. And by clicking Edit Query Statement, here's where you would graphically build out your query, right? Or notice this, Show Query Language. So this is essentially an editor. I can go in here and type in whatever I want to for my query, and if you know what you're doing writing out your query, it would work fine. Here's, again, a nuance to understand. So for anyone who's spent much time in SQL, this looks very similar to a SQL query statement. It is not. This is a WQL query statement, WebM query language. It is very similar looking to SQL. It is not the same as SQL. Some statements that you would do in SQL, you can absolutely have equivalents to in WQL. Some query statements, a lot of them, very complex query statements you can do in SQL, will not translate, will not work in WQL. Here's the other thing. SQL query statements run against the SQL database, whether it's the tables, the views, whatever. WQL query statements run against WMI namespaces and classes. So you have to understand the difference and know which ones to pick if you're going to write it yourself. That's why it's frankly just easier to use the graphical design area for building your query, right? So let me show you that. So whenever I'm going to build my query, I have three options: general, joins, and criteria. So criteria is where you go to specify the details about the query. So I can just click on Starburst, and you'll notice that I have several different kinds of query statements I can use. I can do a null query, I can do attribute references, subselects, I can do a list, which is essentially just a glorified direct membership in essence, right? The most common type is this thing called a simple value, and I'll show this one to you. So if I choose simple value, it's basically going to ask me what attribute, what class that attribute's in, and what value I want it to have to include in this collection. So to do the where statement, so again, think of this in terms of a select statement. There's a where component. So the where is what we're trying to say. We're going to say select the attribute class might be any one of these. Now, compare this to the list of system resources that I had in the direct membership example. You're going to see there's a huge difference. This is extremely rich in terms of what you can pick, right? Certainly, system resource is one of the options, but it is one of a ton of options that you have as a query that you did not have as direct, right? So I can pick system resource, and when I pick the class, the top level class, I'm going to have all the attribute names that I had visible over in the direct membership because that's part of the class. I could pick other classes too. So notice, so this is where we talk about why this is pivotal to some of the other components in Config Manager as well. One of those other components we mentioned was compliance settings. So compliance settings is something you can base a collection off of. So I can go down to, where is it? Why am I not seeing it? There it is. Configuration item compliance state, right? Configuration item compliance state, one of the types of configuration items in the Config Manager world is a compliance settings baseline. Well, there's a lot of other configuration items as well, such as software updates, such as application models, such as a number of things. So you can build collections based off of information that comes back as part of a configuration item. You can build it off of hardware inventory. You can build it off a number of different things. Discovery data, right? So let me show you this. So system resource, down here, system resource, this is discovery data, right? And you wouldn't know that just by looking at this, but trust me that it is. It's discovery data. But there's other stuff in here that would contain similar information, like, I don't know, system, right? So let's look at system resource for a minute, and again, remind you of the attributes. Bunch of different attributes here, right? Well, if I go to system, you'll see some similarity, right? Maybe. Okay, so name, that's certainly similar, and so on, right? So why would you choose one versus the other? The answer is both could be applicable, and you would choose based on your needs, whatever surfaced. But here's the point, right? Sometimes I've seen customers, actually it happened recently, that will build a query that relies on both discovery data, which is the system resource, and hardware inventory data, which is the system that I just showed you. And there's a whole bunch of other examples of it in there. And that works great, except in situations where a system maybe has never reported hardware inventory, right? Maybe they've maybe never reported discovery. Maybe there's a problem out there and they don't have discovery data. So the point of that is be aware of what you're asking for. Be aware of whether it's really valid to ask for it that way, and build your query appropriately. If all you need is discovery data based information, there's no reason to include something like hardware inventory, which is just an additional component that you have to factor in. Doesn't update like discovery data does, right? So just bear that in mind. Again, as you're building the query, are you overscoping it? Are you underscoping it? Is it giving you just exactly what you need, right? and then you're going to be better off if you keep it as limited in scope as possible. So let's stick with system in our example just to do it, and I'm going to say system, I don't know, system type here. Okay, hit OK, and then is equal to and value. So just like before, I can specify a wildcard. Maybe I don't know the value, and I can pop up here and say, okay, x86 PC, x64 based PC. So I just want x64 based PCs, and I'll hit OK. So my first criteria is only x64 based PCs will be in this collection. And it's dynamic. So if another x64 PC ever comes into the environment, this query will update, and it will include that system once it does the update, right? Which we'll talk about update in a minute. So then on the General tab, you'll see that this will actually fill out with some of the properties that's going to be part of the collection in a minute. I'll come back to it. Now, that's one kind of criteria. I can go back and add additional criterias, and these criterias will join together to give me a total view of the environment. So this is another interesting discussion, right? So you could build compound queries that look at a bunch of different things, the discovery and the hardware inventory example. You could put that in one query. But if you write the query yourself, right? But graphically, you would put together statements individually that just make it easier for you to conceptualize what you actually want versus having to write it yourself, right? So don't push yourself into writing query language and such. The design is actually pretty nice, and so if we look at our query language now, you'll see that we just updated some of the query statement as to what we want. Right? Okay, so I'm going to hit OK, and then if I come back into here, you're going to notice that now I thought I would. I thought I had general criteria. It doesn't show up here yet. It should at some point once I run the query, I guess. But then there's joins, right? So any joins that happen in your query, you will see listed out here. So you can add new ones and so on if you want to. Again, that gets to be a bit more advanced. But most of the time you can get what you need under criteria. Well, what if you want to go with this model, but you actually want something that's not in this list? Okay? Are you stuck? Can you do anything about the list and add data to it, or what? Well, the answer is you can extend this list quite effectively, right? Remember, most of the two classes of information here are discovery and hardware inventory based data, really. Okay, there's some other things, but that's the two main ones. So if you were to go extend your hardware inventory to collect whatever data off of your systems that you need, the new hardware inventory class that you create would show up here. So then you could use it for building collections, right? Well, that's a whole different discussion about how to extend hardware inventory. It's not hard. It's really cool to be able to do it. And then it opens up the possibilities a lot more, but it would show up here. If you have additional discovery data that you extend, and it is possible to extend discovery data too, that would show up here. So it's totally possible to carve this out and make it reflect whatever you need in terms of building collection criteria, but what we have as a base is a pretty good start. Generally, very, very usable just as is for most environments. Right? So that's building query base. Well, let's go. I'm going to cancel this and hit OK, and hit OK. So there I have a query based. So you see these live together quite effectively. So I'm going to get rid of that one because it's basically going to have one of the same characteristics in here. And then I'm going to go forward and we will look at this query. So I believe it's this one that I just created. So once I have it created, then before it gets membership, you'll see member count and members visible on site. I'll need to update the membership. That would happen naturally over time, and we'll come back and see if we have any details in this as we move along. And then I need to refresh it and so on. So this can take a couple of minutes, especially in a hierarchy like I have. Right? So while we're here, I didn't want to explicitly call this out, and I don't think it applies. It doesn't apply to a single primary site environment, but it's certainly worth noting, right? So if you're looking at the console, you'll see member count and then members visible on site. What the heck is this? This really only applies in a hierarchy. So when you have your console focused at the top of the hierarchy, the CAS, then the member count total and the members visible at site total should be the same because you're looking at the unified environment. Whereas if you had your ConfigMgr console connected to a child primary site, then the member count would reflect only those clients that are owned and reporting to the primary site directly. Whereas the member count would reflect total member count, whereas the members visible on site would only be those that are directly owned and managed by the child primary site. So we show you that to let you know, hey, this collection that you're working with, there's only a certain number of clients that are on your primary site, but the total count is bigger than what you think it is. So just know whenever you do something to this collection, it's going to impact not just the small number that you think is at your site, but every client in the hierarchy, right? That's another difference in 2012. In 2007, whenever you did something at a child primary site, it only impacted that child primary site and any child primaries below it, or any site servers below it. In 2012, whenever you take an action at any primary site in the hierarchy, it would impact every primary site in the hierarchy, right? So again, for single primary or environments, it doesn't apply, but that is definitely something to keep in mind if you're working in a hierarchy. All right, so we'll come back to this in a minute and see if the numbers update. Okay, so let's pull the lab back out and talk a bit more. So in terms of that's the criteria. In terms of updating, we have two mechanisms that will allow us to update our collection membership. One is this thing called an incremental update, and then there's this thing called a full collection update, right? So let's look at those real quick. So let's pull the lab back in and look at our test collection that we created right here. And if I go to properties on it, you're going to see under membership rules this option, use incremental updates for this collection, or schedule a full update this collection. I don't see a membership rule here. I actually think that might not be the one that I just created. So let me make sure that I'm looking at the right one. Either I didn't save the collection I just created, or I wasn't looking at the right one. Well, no matter. I will use one that I know has a criteria on it. So whatever, we'll do this one just to show you. Okay, so here I have some direct criteria, whatever, no big deal. Now, so if I'm in a direct membership collection, does it make any sense to update that collection membership? By default, your collection will be set to update. A direct membership collection does not need to be routinely updated, really, because the membership is static. Now, if you're changing the direct membership rules, and it's kind of in flux because this is a collection you're manually managing a lot, probably does make sense to keep the refresh in place, right? Because what you would need to do whenever you change the direct rules, you would need to at least make sure the collection updated at least once. So if you forget to do that, having it on a schedule would allow it to catch up at some point. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me to do an incremental update at all. In fact, if you wanted to turn off updating altogether, you can, and you just manually manage the collection, which isn't a big deal because you're manually managing it anyway, right? And it's going to, if you have a bunch of direct membership collections, by turning off the updating on those, it's going to take some load off of the site server. Is it a huge deal? No, but it could add up, especially in really, really large environments. I'm talking, multiple tens of thousands of systems. It could be an interesting optimization discussion, right? But not necessary. On a query-based collection, these routine updates are what drive the query-based collection to update. Let me find one. Not that it matters for the discussion, but just to be talking about one. Well, whatever. I don't know this would be a good example. Probably not. It's a base collection, so whatever. But this is query-based, so I can't change it because it's a base collection. But you see that here I just have incremental updates turned on. Typically, you'd have incremental and full collection updates turned on. But here's the point of this, right? When the query runs, it's going to go find every machine that is satisfied by that query. Well, say that when the query runs, it finds 100 machines. But only one of those 100 machines has actually changed from the last time the query ran, the full query ran. If you're doing a full collection update, you have to process all 100 records even though only one of them changed. So it's extra load on the site server to process all 100 of those records when there really is no point in processing 99 of them. All you want to process is the one that's changed. So the incremental collection updates allows us to run the query, check what has changed. If nothing's changed, we don't process anything. If one machine's been added, deleted, whatever, then we'll just process that one machine. So the load, even though you're running the collection query much more frequently, every 5 minutes when you do an incremental update, you're actually gaining a tremendous amount of efficiency because you're not actually processing data unless something's changed, right? So you might go through a bunch of incremental updates and nothing has changed, and so you don't process anything. We do recommend the full update every week. So it used to be that the full update happened every day, once every 24 hours in Config Manager 2007, because early on in Config Manager 2007 there wasn't this thing called an incremental update. That was introduced around Config Manager 2007 R2, I think. Anyway, but now that we have the incremental, we bump the full back to once every 7 days. Why? Because we do want to have a catch-all just to make sure and process all of the machines and make sure they're fresh in this collection. But we don't want to do that every time, so we give you the incremental ability. Do you have to use incremental? No. You can absolutely use full as your only means of updating the collection. If it's something that makes sense to only update every so often, that's fine. It's totally up to you. We give you the controls and let you use them however you would like. Right? Okay. So what else do we have on collections? We have the custom classes. We've talked about that. And generally speaking about collections, general guidance is you don't want to overdo collections. I mean, certainly build what you need, but there are opportunities to reduce the number of collections that you need, such as in the application model, which really isn't part of this discussion, but it's pivotal because a lot of the things that customers historically have built collections to handle, the application model, specifically the requirements rules inside the application model, can substitute for and help you reduce the number of collections. The whole idea being, if you reduce the number of collections, it relieves the site server of having to process some of these things and can offload the processing for some of them to the client, right? So again, something to consider. Build what you need, but don't overdo it, right? And then also in terms of organization, you can very nicely organize your collections into folders. So pull that back in. And all of mine are at the root level. Come on. All of mine are at the root level, but you can certainly go and create folders and so on. Import, export collection definitions and so on from here as well. Create new collections, all that, from here. But so that's that. Now, while I am on the collection, let's talk about a few more things. And I don't remember if I'm jumping ahead. Maybe I am, and it's on the PowerPoint in a minute. Either way, we're going to cover it. So let's do it while we're here. So we talked about the different components of Config Manager that rely on collections. So deploying applications. Any deployment that you do has to tie to a collection so that we know where in the world to deploy this thing. right? Well, there's those are applications, compliance settings, packages, software updates, task sequences, on we go. There are certain things that are defined on the collection itself. Any collection that you go to, so I'll just pick this one, whatever. Any collection that you go to will have certain tabs, right? So these are the two we've been on so far. There's this tab for power management. So one of the features in ConfigMgr 2012 is the ability to manage the power settings on machines. So every collection has the ability to set up power management options. So traditionally speaking, well, and still now, collections are used for deploying something to your environment. You want to set up your collections in a manner so that you target just those devices or users in your environment that you actually want to implement that change on. So traditionally, you think of deploying software or something like that. You can deploy power management settings as well. The best practice here would be, if you're going to deploy power management settings, that you have collections specifically designed only for managing power management. They're not used for deployments. They're not used for maintenance windows, which we'll talk about in a minute. They're not used for anything else. They are strictly built and maintained for the point of power management, right? And that way you know what clients are in them, you know what the expected result will be, and so on. Power management settings are really useful, so you can turn those on if you want to, specify the settings that you want. This applies to all of the supported operating systems that we have in ConfigMgr 2012. The actual implementation will be a bit different depending on the OS. XP is going to be different from Vista, going to be different than 7 in terms of power management, but we all work that out on the client level. And you can set this thing up. So you can go into the power management. Again, this is a whole different tangent into another discussion, but just the point, it's here, right? You set it up on a per collection basis. Another option that you can see all the deployments that are targeted to your collection here. Can't really impact anything here, but you can see it. Maintenance windows is another item that you can deploy to your environment based on the collection, right? And this is another place that we recommend having separate collections for the purpose of deploying maintenance windows to your environment. So, for example, if you have a device that is in a collection and you're using that collection for both deployment and maintenance windows, and you're doing that throughout your environment, and say that device is in 3 of the collections that have maintenance windows set, the maintenance window for that device will now be additive. All 3 of the maintenance windows will apply to that device, which is maybe what you want, maybe not what you want, right? Can lead to unexpected results. Whereas if you keep your environment kind of separated, so your collections that manage maintenance windows are separate and apart from those collections you use for deployments, then you're going to be able to visualize and see what the maintenance window is based on the collection that a device is in, right? And so it just works out better that way. Again, maintenance windows are additive. If you want to do it that way, it's great. It works fine, but just bear that in mind. Okay. Also, calling out maintenance windows in ConfigMgr 2012 R2, there actually will be a maintenance window that is specific to software updates, and then a separate maintenance window for everything else. So if that is important to you, we can definitely handle that once we get R2 out the door. So that was talked about at TechEd and so on. That's a known quantity coming in ConfigMgr 2012 when R2 when it releases. Other things in here. So collection variables, right? So collection variables are those things, variables in general are used in a task sequencing environment. I don't say operating system deployment because that would be valid. You know, task sequences are used typically for operating system deployment, but not exclusively for operating system deployment. So you can set variables for use in operating system deployment or task sequencing in a number of different ways. This is one of them. You can tie variables to the collection And systems that are in that collection, when they start to run the task sequence, will inherit those variable settings that you can then use, and it makes the task sequencing environment much more robust, much more flexible. Again, that is a discussion that could span an entire series of sessions, so we'll avoid going into it further there. But leave that as it is, right? So that's here, right? There's other places again that you can put variables in place. Collection is just one. You can do it directly on the machine, and so on. Last thing that we'll look at here, and you can configure it here. I don't know that I would directly, but one of the new things in Configuration Manager 2012 in terms of collections is you can associate a collection with a distribution point group. Easiest way to see that is to actually come over here and look at a distribution point group. So if I go to a distribution point group and look at properties, one of the things I can do is associate it with a collection. So I can go add a collection to a distribution point group. Right? I can do users or device collections. I can put in this one, right? So not directly collection related in the discussion, but the question is, why in the world would you care to do that? Why would you associate a device or a collection with a distribution point group? The answer is if you want to shortcut the deployment process by one check mark, then you can do it this way. So if you have a particular collection that represents the systems, if you have a particular collection that represents maybe a region, maybe you're have distribution points in east and distribution points in west and distribution points in central, and so whenever you do a deployment to east, there's a collection that contains uniquely all the devices in the east, and whenever you go deploy it to that collection, it needs to always stage to the distribution points that are part of this distribution point group. So you can pair up the collection, so when you target that collection for deployment, it just automatically associates the content for that deployment and rolls it out to the distribution points, right? Whether this is useful to you, it's completely up to your environment. It's an option. Again, it's a little bit of a time saver. If you're going to use this, then you want to make sure that your collections are well maintained, and that if something doesn't fall into targeting anymore, that you disassociate that from linking into the distribution point group. Again, if you make a mistake here, it's probably not that big a deal. The only side effect would be you would probably have content on distribution points that you may not have wanted it on. That's easy enough to clear out. But again, it's there for you. If you like that kind of association, you can use it. Right. Okay. So let's continue on. So in terms of security for a minute. So we kind of laid the stage about security and how you can carve out through the limiting a scope for your users to be able to view. So the example we were using is server admins versus workstation admins, right? And so we're going to continue with that example. Actually, let me pull you back to the console for me. I forgot to mention one thing. So if I go into my collection, so I mentioned this discussion of the operating system deployment web page, right? And how you can use that web page to drive static collection membership, and you absolutely can. That's just one example of external ability to influence a collection. Well, just like you can use that static web page in that operating system deployment example to define collection membership, you can also use it to specify collection variables. So if you were, as this example, deploying an operating system to certain machines, and you wanted those certain machines to be installed with certain criteria, then you could specify those criteria as variables that are then interpreted by the task sequence, and do all that programmatically so that they're here, right? That just wanted to tie that in because it was one thing I forgot to mention. Again, advanced task sequencing for sure, but also enables great agility in terms of the task sequence. Okay, so the security limiting the collection membership is going to help you scope your view for sure, but that's just one thing. That's just one piece. So once you scope your view, you have to align that view to the users in your environment where you want to limit their experience, right? So if we go to the security node, there's a number of options here. I won't focus on the other ones. I'll focus on just this one. But if we go to administration and sorry, let me relaunch the console. So if we go to administration and then go to security, we're going to have administrative users, right? Well, I just have one. It's my small lab. So if I go to properties of this administrative user, and maybe this is user Bob or Joe or Mary or whoever it is that you're wanting to limit their view, plug them into the right server versus workstation view or whatever that scoping is, right? Then you can come under security scopes, and you can say that all you want this user to be able to see are instances of these specific scopes, which we haven't talked about, or collections. So you see by default, this user is able to see the all systems collection and the all users and user groups. Well, you don't want, if you're trying to scope this user to just the servers, you don't want them to be able to see all systems. Instead, you might want to remove these from their default scope and add a collection and say my test collection maybe is going to be all servers. Down here I should have called it all servers. Hit OK. And now if I were to hit OK here, which I don't want to, but if I were to, when this user opens the console, the only thing they see is this base collection, which in this example would be all the servers. And that's it. So even though there are a bunch of workstations in the system, they will never see them. They will only see what you have at the base. Now, obviously, that means that it's incumbent upon whoever builds this base collection to make sure they get it right? Because whatever's in that collection, this user is going to see as their base. So if the collection's built wrong and it includes workstations, well, they're going to see workstations even though you don't intend for them to. But as long as you have the collection built well at a base, they're only going to see whatever they have in that collection. And then here's the beautiful thing of it. As they go to build additional collections themselves as part of administration in the server space, the only limiting collection then that they will have ability to tie onto is this one that you started them with. So you're kind of boxing them into a sandbox and saying you can do whatever you need to do, but you can only do it on these systems, right? So this is a very key linchpin in the way we help you scope out and deliver security in Configuration Manager 2012 through collections. All right. So let's keep going here. All right. So a lot on collections here. Now, that's kind of the administrative piece, and that'll get you way down the road, and probably you won't ever have to go into what I'm about to show you briefly here. But in terms of what happens behind the scenes, whenever you mess with these collections, I want to just touch briefly on the internals, if you will. So all of the different things that you do in the console have to be processed by certain components in Configuration Manager. Most of those components, in fact, all of them, are running under a thread, a service called the SMS Executive, right? Well, the SMS Executive is a service on the site server that does a whole bunch of things. One of those things in the collection world is it will evaluate, deal with the collection changes that you make, right? So those collection changes could be updating a collection, maybe changing the query rules or direct membership or whatever. Could be creating a new collection, deleting an existing collection, whatever. All of that detail is going to be surfaced in this log called Collection Evaluator, right? Here's another thing, just on a standalone primary, you only have one site, so it's going to be on that site. If you're in a hierarchy, just to draw the parallel, a hierarchy in Configuration Manager is only for those situations where the scale of your environment grows beyond what you can do with a single primary. In those scenarios, you're going to add what's called a CAS, which is the top level server, but the functions for direct client management are still only going to be at those child primaries. So collection evaluator is going to be at the child primary site because that's where you need to be evaluating the collections. Because why? Collections are used specifically in deployments, not anything else. So the engine for making sure those collections are built well, maintained well, is going to exist on a child primary site. I mentioned that only to say if you go into a hierarchy and you're looking for collection evaluator at the CAS, it doesn't exist there, as well as other specific client management pieces don't exist at the CAS because the CAS is not intended for client management. They only exist at the child primary, right? So you'll see that as I look in my environment here. I've been showing you the CAS so far. Up here, this is my CAS, but I'll show you the child primary in just a minute as I kind of talk through this example. So the example on the table here is that I've gone through and I wanted to create a new device collection, right? So you've seen me create this test collection as we've gone along, right? And I've also, before we got started, deleted a collection as well. And I did that for the sole purpose of showing you how this kind of works, right? So any action you take to do an update, so if I right-click and delete a collection, if I right-click and create a collection, if I go through and update a collection, where is it? There we go. If I update membership, whatever, all of that is going to trigger some back-end processing to implement the change that I've asked for, right? Well, that back-end processing takes place at both the file system level and at the SQL level, right, to implement the change. So in the file system level, when I add a collection, as an example, here's my child primary site, you'll see that I have an ADC, right? These ADC files are 0 length. Notice I'm under inboxes, call-eval.box. This is on my child primary. ADC, ADC, these are both add collection, right? These are the unique identifiers of the collection. So you can actually find the unique identifier in the console. Let me see if I can show you. So if I go to properties on a collection, you're going to see the collection ID. This one's 2C. So I pull in my environment, you'll see there is in fact one here for 2C, an update collection. Here's an add collection for 2C, right? So if you see these IDs, you can quickly tie them back to what collection it actually is, and you can see that there's pending work to be done. So normally you wouldn't see anything in this box. You shouldn't, right? There's only 2 reasons you'll see anything in this box, really. One is that there's a backlog and there's a problem processing collections, which is a problem. The other that I've seen is if you have aggressive virus scanning tools like on-demand scanning of your inboxes, sometimes we'll tie up these files and we can never delete them, which is why we recommend that you disable on-demand virus scanning for most of the SMS folders, including the inboxes specifically and the logs and so on. All right, not to disable virus scanning, but to disable on-demand virus scanning because they just get in there and tie us up too much sometimes. Right, but you'll see these here, and I've stopped the processing on my child primary site specifically so you can see them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be here. So ADC again, add collection, UDC update collection, and then DC is a delete collection. So whenever I take action, flag files are going to be dropped in here to alert collection evaluator. This change needs to be processed, right? Well, collection evaluator is going to show you all of the processing that takes place. So if I go back out of my inbox and go into logs, actually let me restart collection evaluator. You'll see these disappear. Rename. And by the way, big disclaimer, I'm doing this in my lab. I would not recommend you do this in production at all. Right? If this is something, if you're troubleshooting at this level, it's definitely something that support needs to be engaged on because there can be problems by doing certain things in this area. So I'll stop now the executive and restart it so that collection evaluator starts to process. Come on, type. All right, so it's going to stop and restart collection evaluator or executive, and then when we're done with that, we should see the inbox clear out of those files. We should also see collection evaluator start to run. I'm going to go ahead and kill the thread just to make sure that it restarts quickly, because it's kind of been disabled for a while, which can cause some things to back up. Maybe it just did it before I got to it, so it just restarted. Cool. So we should be able to go into collection evaluator log and see that it's being restarted, see some of those files processed, and so on. So I'll go into collection evaluator log. Come on. All right. It'll restart in just a minute, hopefully. And we'll see. But even before, I'll go ahead and pause this. And even before it restarts, you can see that we're going through, and periodically we're going to be checking out. So we'll, every 5 minutes with the incremental updates, we're going to check various collections. If I scroll up, you'll see, checking this collection, 0 entries changed. So that's just one of our periodic updates that we do to see if something's changed. So you can go in here, if you're troubleshooting a problem and this thing never changes, do a full collection update, whatever, see what's changed, see what didn't, and so on. As you add a collection, delete a collection, you'll see the changes in here, and so on. So you can track very effectively just by reading through the log the evaluation of our collections, how long it takes. This is actually something to keep an eye on. So if you're in a situation where it just takes forever to update a collection, that can happen sometimes if your collection criteria are overly complex, or if the query statement that results from what you've built is overly complex. You can track how long it takes to evaluate your collection query in the log. We'll tell you how long it took. Well, if you're seeing a query take 10, 20, 30 seconds or more, that's a really long time for the query. And so you should really take a look at it and see if you've optimized it. Do you really need it to be that complex? Usually you're going to see queries evaluate in a second or two. Right? Obviously it'll change depending on the environment size, but it's a good way to keep an eye on your environment and how efficient things are going. All right? And so on. So let me unpause this, see if we actually got this thing started back up. Not yet, but that's okay. We'll move on. You get the idea. There is additional information. So remember, all of this stuff that's happening, hopefully we should have the files gone from collection evaluator by now. Oh, not yet. So that's why it hasn't shown up. So did it restart? Let's see. I might have mistyped it. Let's see. That might be what's going on. Well, let's try to restart it again. See if I fat fingered it. Okay, so it's running. So whatever. I don't know. I'll deal with that later. But you get the idea, right? So all of the things that happen in ConfigMgr, really, on the server side anyway, the threads there, have it against the database. If you want to see additional detail about what's happening on the server, right? Actually, before I show you this, I'm going to have to make sure this is working. So let me stop this again. Stop it. SMS executive. So we'll let that go down, and then we'll restart it. I also want to make sure the DLL is named correctly. I didn't fat finger that. So we'll let that stop, and then I'll check the DLL. There we go. So give me a second while I check in there. There we go. Oh, C is still renamed. That was the problem. All right, so let's do this, and now it should start. All right, good enough. So if we look in this box as we're talking, these should ultimately disappear, right? So as these process, you may or may not see everything you want to see in the log. It could be that you run into an error. Maybe you're seeing a query that takes a long, long time. Here, you see a lot of processing going on now, updates to the collection. So it's churning through. So it's done, right? So you'll see all that in the log when I open it up. It could be that you want to know more detail about what's happening. So since all of this is really running SQL queries in the back end, you could get that additional detail on this, or frankly, most other server components that talk directly to the database by enabling what's called SQL tracing. So again, this is not something to leave on unless you need it for diagnostics, but if you need it, it's good to have. So SQL enabled. Under this registry key, okay, you can set it to 1, and you do not need to restart the executive. But what you can do is be able to see a difference in the log. So what I'm going to do is just show you the log right now without it, and then restart the executive again and show you the log with it. All right, so call eval. Again, a lot of good detail even without it. Right, you see us doing our express evaluation and incrementing and different things. But now let's watch with it. So if I go stop my collection or executive, so you see that the component is stopping that back there in the log. Wait on it to stop. Stop quicker. See if I can type ahead. There we go. Let's start. So we'll start it back. And then this time, theoretically, we'll see SQL tracing pop in here. There we go. See that? So now in the log, we actually see all of the SQL statements that are happening behind the scenes. So it makes for a much busier log, but very useful information in case you're really trying to troubleshoot and understand what's happening behind the scenes, why something might be not processing right, or giving you, slower response time or whatever. Again, if you're troubleshooting at this level, you really should probably be talking to someone in support, but it's definitely worth knowing that you can at least get to this level of detail. So before I go back to the PowerPoint, then I'll turn this off. Good enough. Cool. All right, so I'll go ahead and close this one down, move this out, and I'm good, right? So that's really it. I mean, the collections are a very very important part. Oh, let me say this one thing about it before I leave it. I completely was going to miss this. So we've spent time talking about device collections. There's also user collections, right? User collections, the options on user collections are similar in some ways, but there's many fewer of them. There's not maintenance windows. There's no power management, things like that. There are distribution point groups, so you can tie users collections to distribution point groups too. The criteria for building these is similar to what you have for devices. There are different options in terms of classes and things like that. The whole point of having user collections as the focus for your deployment is if what you're trying to deploy is uniquely being targeted to the user. So the deployments discussions will pick more about this in terms of the way users are factored into ConfigMgr 2012. But building collections based on users will allow you to uniquely carve out user populations that need maybe to receive an application. So maybe if HR needs a particular application published to them, you could do that by targeting a collection of users. Everyone in today's world with modern devices is very accustomed to going to a store, an Apple store, a Windows store, a Google store, whatever, right? Well, we offer a ConfigMgr store. We call it the application catalog that users can go to self-service applications that are published to them that they might want to install. You're not going to force it onto them. It's not going to be a mandatory required deployment, but you could actually deploy an application to a user optional. You can actually force it if you want to, but you can make it optional. So it shows up in the catalog. They have a choice of running it or not, right? And it kind of creates your own self-service store, right, based on the users. And users will see specifically what's targeted to them in terms of the collections that they're in as a member of a user group, or explicitly as a member of a collection by their user ID. Right? All the rest of what we talked about with collections generally applies here. I mean, certain things don't apply because it's a user instead of a system, but the concept of collections definitely applies. Right? So again, a little bit more on user device affinity is applicable whenever deployments come into being and discussion. But that's kind of a whirlwind discussion, end to end, if you will, of collections, how they work, why they're important, how to build them, some strategy around them, and so on. So in terms of the collection discussion, I'll wrap up here, and if you have any questions, please feel free.